Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ulrike Schneider. I'm from the Vienna University of Economics and Business, and I'm not here to give a presentation, so relax. It's my pleasure to introduce our next plenary speaker, our colleague from the University of Chicago, Professor Tamara Konetzka. You see, she's going to present on the economics of integration. Her fields of interest are health economics. She's been doing a lot of work on the nexus of funding of healthcare and long-term care, and also quality of care. And so this is probably a perfect issue for you to talk about, and we are looking very much to your presentation, which is going to take certainly 40 minutes, so probably we won't have time to discuss right after this presentation, but you probably will attend the conference dinner, and so expect a lot of comments there, probably. Okay? So, good. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you.
So thank you, Ulrika, for that introduction. I'd also like to thank Jose Luis for inviting me to do this plenary today, and for organizing a lovely conference, and for dealing so efficiently with all of the problems that were thrown at him this morning. In case anyone is still confused, I'm not Tim Weir or Matthias von Schwanenflugel, who are on the program in this time slot. The slots were switched, so if you came to see them, too bad you missed them this morning. This is Dorothea. She's an 85-year-old woman who lives in Florida in the southern part of the U.S. She is insured through Medicare, the public health insurance program for the elderly in the U.S. She is actually my mother, so I know a lot about her health. She's in fairly good health, very active, walks every day, but she does have some health problems. She's diabetic, she's on lots of medications for chronic conditions, and she has very frequent falls. In the last few years, she's managed to break bones in 4 different parts of her body and get her face really bruised up. But fortunately, every time this has happened, the injuries were not so severe that she actually had to be admitted to the hospital. She was able to navigate her own care through visits to a series of specialists, none of whom actually talk to each other, but she's been able to navigate that care. But imagine that she has a more serious injury one of these days that does land her in the hospital. What I'm going to describe is probably a typical trajectory, and it's the kind of story one hears all the time, I think in the US and probably elsewhere as well. That is, she might get to the hospital, arrive, and the hospital will not have any information on her whatsoever. They'll try to go through a long history, and hopefully she'll tell them all the meds she's on, etc. That hospital faces a strong incentive through the Medicare PPS system to discharge her as quickly as possible, because they get paid per discharge. They don't want her there any extra days. So she will probably get discharged to a skilled nursing facility or home with home health care for rehab. That transfer might occur, again, with very little information, and it may occur too soon because that hospital wants to discharge as soon as possible. Each of those providers will have its own set of financial specific incentives. Home health, for example, is paid per discharge, so they're going to want to limit the intensity of care. It might also occur with very little information transfer, and if she gets sent home, she may have very little ability or knowledge about how to manage those conditions herself and guide herself through a recovery, and she may not know where to turn to ask questions. So all of that scenario sets up a high risk of adverse events. There may be medication errors, there may be a readmission to the hospital, and if indeed after that she still needs long-term care, that presents even more transitions, because not only may she have to change the setting of care, but she may also have to change the payer. All of this time, through this entire incident, probably her primary care doctors or other doctors may not even know that she was hospitalized, may not have been informed. It'll be up to her to go figure out what she needs to tell these doctors and what she needs to do to follow up with her care. And probably nowhere in here is anybody actually trying to figure out how to reduce falls in the future. So I think we can all agree that fragmentation is probably a bad thing. Fragmentation of care is bad. It's synonymous with lack of coordinated care across settings, and indeed the medical and health services literature warns repeatedly that the lack of coordinated care is associated with poor quality of care, lots of adverse outcomes, and probably also with inefficiency, because patients are getting services they don't need, or having avoidable adverse events. And that inefficiency may be associated also with higher cost. Accordingly, there are a lot of recent policies lately that focus on trying to increase coordination of care across care settings. In the US, for example, we have accountable care organizations. And in this model of care, groups of physicians or hospitals take on responsibility for all the costs of care and the quality of a panel of patients that are in their accountable care organization, including all of the services that those patients get, not just from that physician group or from that hospital. In the bundled payments model, you might have, for example, across hospitals and post-acute care providers, instead of having two separate payments, a single payment, and the hospital has to figure out how best to allocate care and the money across those two organizations. Readmissions penalties are levied against hospitals for more than expected or a higher than expected rate of readmissions to the hospital, and those penalties are designed to give them an incentive to care about what happens after they discharge people from the hospital, which traditionally is not the case, and potentially to communicate better with those other providers post-discharge. Finally, there are Medicare and Medicaid alignment experiments going on in a lot of states in the US. Medicare is the health insurance program for the old. Medicaid is the health care system for the poor, but a lot of people receiving long-term care, especially those in nursing homes, but increasingly those also in home and community-based care, are part of both systems, and traditionally there were conflicting incentives, and there are a lot of demonstrations to try to remove those conflicting incentives and provide them a more coordinated care experience. So how are these going to work? There are a lot of theories that these policies are going to increase coordination by incentivizing integration across settings. And so in the trade literature, you can see a lot of statements to this effect. Also, if you just sort of Google healthcare integration, you see a lot of new consulting companies all of a sudden setting up to try to help providers navigate integration and choose their integration partners wisely. So is integration good if this is going to be a primary vehicle for increasing coordination? Well, if fragmentation is so bad, it might seem self-evident that integration is going to be a good thing, right? Integrated providers, if they're sort of one joint entity or are joining forces in their goals, will probably provide more coordinated care. You would hope that they would reduce unnecessary care and transitions and improve the information flow. So in these ways, integration might be a really good thing. And if they are indeed reducing unnecessary care and finding a more efficient allocation of resources, then you might expect lower costs as well, although that's kind of an open question. So one example of how integration might help increase efficiencies and improve coordination of care is this example from Guy David and colleagues, where traditionally you have the hospital with its own financial incentives and the home health agency with its own financial incentives. And the hospital, of course, wants to get rid of the patient as quickly as possible. The home health agency is also paid per discharge, so they want the hospital to keep that person as long as possible, and they want to get the patient farther along the road to recovery so that they can provide a lower intensity of care. So you have this tension, and where that discharge actually happens, or at what point in that patient's recovery, is almost certainly not the optimal point. It just depends on the strength of those two organizations. But if they're integrated, there is this whole set of tasks in the middle of this person's recovery that really could be done in either setting. And if they're integrated, they can sort of find the most efficient point to transfer the person to the home health agency. Since home health is cheaper, it's probably going to be earlier than one would see under the traditional model. So this is one way, sort of finding that optimal point of discharge and looking at care for the entire person and cost for the entire person that an integrated firm could be more efficient. So as an economist, I'm legally required to give you a much more pessimistic view of integration. And economists have been studying integration for a very long time. You might think of it as sort of sanctioned kind of collusion. So yes, integration may create efficiency gains, but integration can also be anti-competitive. And I think this is the part that in current policies, people sort of forget about that part. And it may be anti-competitive because the two parts of the integrated firm will sort of preferentially take patients or promise beds to each other. and other providers may be blocked from those patients for those beds. And if you have a sort of assured patient base, then because there's less competition, then perhaps you feel less motivated to improve quality or efficiency. And to be honest, it's not actually economist. This is a quote that I found in an article in JAMA just a few weeks ago by an MD and a JD saying it's only natural that hospitals would use vertical linkages with other hospitals and physician groups to maximize income. I mean, clearly, integration is not just about coordination of care, but it might be a strategy for profit maximization. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, I want to go through a few definitions or talk about the different kinds of integration we might think about. And I'm really going to focus on vertical integration more than horizontal, but they're both part of the picture. So in horizontal integration, we mean firms who provide similar services joining. So a clear example of this is hospital mergers or nursing home chains. Under vertical integration, we're talking about firms at different parts of the production process or the service continuum joining forces. So clear example of this might be hospitals joining, integrating with post-acute care providers or nursing homes with rehab agencies. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about formal and informal integration. These are sort of less standardized terms, but what I mean by formal integration is really joint legal ownership, like the hospital buying a post-acute care provider. But I think there's increasing interest also in informal integration. And under informal integration, there's no legal connection, but there's a strong interdependence, right? So a hospital might send a lot of patients to a particular SNF who is also very dependent on that particular hospital for most of its patients. And they might sort of strengthen these ties and coordination across the two settings using shared electronic health records or by having providers try to be in both settings and improve continuity across the settings or preferentially sharing patients. But they don't have actual joint ownership. Okay, so what do we know about horizontal and vertical integration? First, starting with horizontal, we actually know a lot, but all of this evidence is basically drawn from literature on hospitals. I'm going to be talking about hospitals a lot today, especially hospitals and post-acute care providers, because I decided to focus within this huge topic on areas where we really have the rigorous economic evidence. And hospitals merging with various other entities is where that evidence exists. So in the hospital merger literature, hospital mergers nearly always reduce competition. That's pretty clear. The subsequent effects on quality and costs are mixed. And they're mixed because healthcare has varied products. And unlike other products where there's a more homogeneous product, you would always expect competition to lead to lower price. Here, there might be competition based on quality or competition based on price. And so in the settings where there's administratively set prices and there really can't be any price competition, we do see that mergers leading to reduced competition tends to also reduce quality. But when there's privately set prices and you have both price competition and quality competition possible, then the effects empirically are actually uncertain. What about vertical integration? Vertical integration is actually probably more interesting for the kinds of care coordination models we're talking about in response to recent policies. But we know a little bit less about vertical integration, and most of the literature was really about price and not so much about quality, although the literature started moving in that direction recently. So in a lot of the earlier studies, they were based on integration between hospitals and physician groups. And the evidence on that kind of integration is a little bit inconclusive, only because some studies found no effects. But where they did find effects, they tended to find that vertical integration was associated with higher prices and spending. So there is this possibility of these anti-competitive effects, and as we think about more integration in healthcare, we have to really think about this possibility of anti-competitive effects. So I'm going to turn now to literature on a different care sector because there's a few interesting papers recently on vertical integration that all focus on this setting, integration between hospitals and post-acute care providers. There's a reason for that. It's a transition point of immense policy focus right now. As you saw from the example about my mother, there's traditionally little coordination in that transition. It's an area where we're spending a lot of money because the hospitalization is very costly, and rehospitalizations are costly, and post-acute care is not only costly, but also one of the fastest growing areas of spending. Most of post-acute care in the US is provided in skilled nursing facilities and in home health agencies, so I'm going to be talking about both of those. And as you can see, the costs of both have been rising pretty steadily since 2001 or so. So now we're spending more than $60 billion a year on post-acute care in Medicare. In terms of the statistics on actual integration, this red line shows integration among home health agencies and hospitals, and the blue line shows integration between SNFs and hospitals. And the first thing to notice is that these rates are not very high, right? Below 4% for home health agencies and below 2% for SNFs. This is actual formal legal integration. The other thing to notice is that contrary to popular belief, the rates of integration have actually been falling. But our data end in 2013, and it's certainly plausible that there's been an uptick lately in response to some of these recent policies. Similarly, informal integration, and I'll spare you the details of how we actually calculated that, but think of it as this sort of strong interdependence based on patient flows between hospitals and post-acute care providers. And the rates are pretty similar, and similarly, they've been falling over time. Again, they might have been increasing again since 2013. That's certainly what one might expect. Okay, I know it's mid-afternoon and siesta time, so I'm not going to drone on and on about econometrics and endogeneity, I promise. But I did want to mention two main methodological issues that are big challenges in this literature and that weren't addressed completely in some of the older literature that I just mentioned. So the first type of selection bias that's important to think about is provider selection. So providers that decide to integrate are just different in many ways from providers that decide not to integrate or that don't enter into these arrangements. And they may be different in ways that we can measure, but they also may be different in ways that we can't measure, their strategic outlook or their management skills. Second, patient selection. So patients choose to go to integrated providers or non-integrated providers. That may be the reason that they choose it or not. It's hard to know. But patients who go to integrated providers may just be different from patients who don't go to integrated providers. And again, we can't always measure and account for those kind of things. And so we need to rely on our econometric toolkit and use tools such as instrumental variables to try to account for that selection and come up with estimates that are not subject to selection bias. So the first paper I want to mention, and these next three papers I'll be talking about are all in the setting of integration between hospitals and post-acute care providers. The first paper was by Guy David and colleagues using a single year of national Medicare data, 2005, and they focused in on this provider selection problem, and they used an instrumental variable using, very briefly, what's going on in the market around them, how many other providers in that market were integrated as an instrument for whether a particular firm was integrated, or a particular hospital, really. They found that hospital integration with home health and nursing home providers led to, just as they predicted, sort of an earlier shift from hospitals into home health or into skilled nursing facilities. So that's just what you would expect from this sort of more efficient resource allocation story that we were talking about earlier. They also found that there was a lower hospitalization rate from nursing homes when firms were integrated, although they didn't find the same for home health. So it looks like a little bit more efficient and potentially better outcomes. They did not look at costs or Medicare spending in this study. The next study that's important to mention is a working paper by Rahman, Norton, and Grabowski. They also use a single year of data, 2009, and they really focused in on this patient selection problem. And they used an incremental variable of differential distance between integrated hospitals and non-integrated hospitals to eliminate the selection bias from patients choosing integrated providers being different from patients not choosing integrated providers. And they found that patients who go to integrated providers, they just looked at SNFs, not home health, but they found that patients who go to integrated providers had also a lower risk of a rehospitalization, so those results were consistent with the David and colleagues study. They also found there was a shorter SNF stay and lower Medicare spending. So they concluded that patients who go to integrated SNFs have shorter stays and lower costs. So these are really interesting results, and they're especially useful, I think, for thinking about it from, let's say, the consumer perspective, where integration can be seen as a signal for going to a better quality facility if you know you're going to need both hospital and post-acute care. It's a little bit less useful because they didn't focus on the provider selection part. It's a little bit less useful to think about the causal effects of new firms deciding to integrate in response to this, in response to these policy incentives. So also in a working paper, Rachel Warner and Liz Stewart and I are conducting kind of a hybrid analysis of these two approaches. We also use the differential distance instrument to address the patient selection problem, but then to address the provider selection problem, we look at a panel of data from 2005 to 2013 and use changes over time in integration status, both newly integrated and unintegrated firms, to assess the effects of becoming integrated or becoming unintegrated. And we find, somewhat consistent with the David paper, that again, there's a lower rate of readmissions from skilled nursing facilities, but we find a longer SNF length of stay and actually more Medicare spending when we account for both of these kinds of selection. And the SNF length of stay, we think, is also consistent with the fact that SNFs are paid on a per diem basis, right? We didn't find the same effect in health, in home health, where they're paid on a per discharge basis, but basically, when hospitals merge with post-acute care providers, they can discharge from the hospital sooner and keep them longer in the SNF because they're also reaping the extra payments per day for that SNF stay. We also, in this study, look at informal integration, and there we really didn't find much of any effect. I think the ability to sort of maximize and set goals across the two settings is just weaker when you have informal integration. So that's perhaps not surprising. So if we look across these hospital post-acute care integration studies, we have a couple of conclusions. One, that controlling for patient and provider selection matters, that the methodology really matters, and that we need really rigorous evaluations of this issue. Two, we conclude that formal integration between hospitals and post-acute care providers appears to improve qualities because we have pretty consistent results about reduced hospitalizations from SNFs. But we really don't find much evidence that the cost scenario is improved. We conclude that more integration is unlikely to save money. It also doesn't appear to improve home health outcomes, and informal integration just doesn't have the same bite as formal integration. Okay, so all of that research was really done before the last couple of years when we do have these new policies, right? So we were looking at informal integration when the incentives attached to ACOs, for example, these accountable care organizations, weren't actually in place. So what do we know from these more recent policies? First of all, we don't know much yet because many of them are too recent. But we do have some preliminary evidence on accountable care organizations. Again, these are the models where either a physician group or a hospital decides to take responsibility for a panel of patients, and they're responsible for meeting quality goals and responsible for all the costs of care for those individuals in the ACO. And the results are really mixed from these so far. We do see improvements in quality, at least those measures of quality that are tied to the bonuses they're getting. But again, we really don't see much of an effect on costs, even though they have more incentives attached to reducing costs than we did in the earlier studies of just integration without these incentives. There's some perhaps promising evidence of some behavior changes that could in the future lead to lower costs, but we don't see it yet. And the other kinds of policies I mentioned, these payment bundlings, the Medicare, Medicaid alignment experiments, I think they're just a little too new for rigorous evidence. There's also obviously lots of smaller scale attempts to increase the coordination in long-term care and other sectors, and some of those you're hearing about at this conference. They're often unclear whether they can be scalable, and we often don't have really rigorous evaluations of them. But obviously that's out there on the landscape as well. Lots of different models that people are trying to increase coordination that sometimes involve integration. So kind of summing across this literature on integration, there are a couple of key policy implications. One is that we really have to think about these anti-competitive effects, that policies that encourage integration, thinking that just more coordination is going to be better, may have these unintended consequences. And the unintended consequences often depend on the underlying payment system. The payment incentives really matter. So from the post-acute and hospital literature, again, home health has a per discharge payment, SNF has a per diem payment. I think that really made a difference in where we found the results. As we move forward, looking at more integration over time, I think the success of these policies and sort of the avoidance of the unintended consequences really depends on aligning the payment integration with the integration of delivery. And that will really require the right incentives and the strong enough incentives to counter those anti-competitive effects on cost. And apparently we haven't found them yet because we haven't found a way in these models to really see a big effect on costs. And finally, what do we still need to know? I think there's a huge research agenda left out there. Certainly, I think we need to study more what the right combination of incentives would be to get the benefits of care coordination while constraining costs. And many of the evaluations that we see, looking at ACOs, looking at bundled payment, even the ones that we looked at, informal and informal vertical integration, they tend to be sort of big picture analyses that look at the entire integration or the entire ACO as kind of a simple pre-post, and yet these are very kind of complicated systems, and the specific design and strength of the incentives will really matter. And I think we need to, after we get past the first stage of the research, really need to dig down into those specific incentives and try to figure out what works and what doesn't work. I think there's still a lot of room for research on the effects of some of these prevalent integration models, for example, the hospital and post-acute integration, on long-term care outcomes, right? So I think a lot of the research is still looking at the sort of first-order direct effects on actual post-acute care and hospital costs and outcomes, but nobody really knows yet what that does to the rest of the care people are getting. And certainly people receiving long-term care are some of those who are cycling through the hospital and post-acute care circle, but nobody's sort of looked at their other costs and effects on the rest of their lives. Finally, a lot of these new policies sort of start out with aligning payment, and I think that is an essential piece. But the idea in these policies, for example, the bundling, is that if we align payment and, for example, just give hospitals one bundled payment and they have to figure out how to cover post-acute care with that, the assumption is that they'll figure out the care delivery part, right? That we're not going to prescribe how the care delivery should be integrated. We're going to align the payment incentives, and the care delivery part will follow. And I think that's still a big open question, whether that will actually happen, and how, and what are the best practices and the best models that people have found to do that. So I think there's still a huge research agenda, lots for all of us to do, and I'll leave you with that. Thank you. I did well on time. Yeah, we do. We have 5 minutes, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. Could you explain some of the terminology? I just wasn't sure about a skilled nursing facility and a home health agency, and I wasn't sure what per diem means either.
Skilled nursing facility and home health and what? Sorry.
Per diem.
Oh, per diem. So a skilled nursing facility is simply a nursing home that provides skilled care, skilled post-acute care. I'm sorry, that wasn't clear. And a home health agency provides, often they provide both post-acute care, skilled care, and sort of chronic care as well in different parts of the agency. But they're both organizations that provide a lot of post-acute care when people are discharged from the hospital, and their goal then is to stabilize patients and get them enough rehabilitation that they're able to go home. And the per diem is just that they get a daily rate, right, as opposed to the per discharge rates. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about the cost savings or excess costs that the Medicare system incurs, and that's the way in which you have focused on this is what you have focused on in the research. What do we actually know about the outcomes for the individuals involved? We spent quite a lot of time at this conference talking about outcomes as measured in a variety of ways, and although you suggest sometimes that there are fewer readmissions, which might be beneficial to the person involved, we actually don't know very much about what the person involved is experiencing, whether his or her well-being has been enhanced in any way by going through one process as opposed to another.
I think that's a great question, because the measures that have been used so far in this literature are really quite limited. So there is tremendous focus on readmissions right now. There are just a multitude of policies aimed at reducing readmissions, because that's where a ton of the money is, right? And so everybody looks at readmissions as an outcome. But the other reason for that is in these large-scale national studies of policy, readmissions is one of those things people can calculate quite easily out of claims data. So all of these use Medicare claims data, basically. But I think your point is well taken that, obviously readmissions is one outcome, and one can argue, that there are many other kinds of outcomes that are equally or more important, and I agree with that completely. I think that's the advantage of some of the non-claims-based, smaller-scale studies where you can kind of collect the data that you really need to assess some of those, right? In these large-scale studies, there's just not the data to do that. But your point is well taken.
Tamara, thanks. That was great. I was going to ask pretty much a similar question to Bernard, so I'll ask a slightly different question. Just an observation for a start. I mean, I think this is tremendously important, because so much of UK policy, or English policy at least, is taking lots of forming its own policy experience on the basis of the US experience and accountable care organisation.
Always seems like a bad idea.
Well, I wasn't going to comment whether it's a good idea or not. It's an observation. But the point, I guess, is and you've touched on this certainly, is that at the moment we're kind of just looking at effectively comparing two black boxes, or two different ways of configuring the system. But actually these are tremendously complicated organizations, and just because you integrate an organization doesn't necessarily change the boundary from within that organization between the different form of care. You're changing the incentives, you're not necessarily changing the boundaries. So there's lots of different ways you could possibly configure your integrated organization. And I think actually once we start to get into some of that detail, we might be able to nuance our arguments about what models work better or not.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. Just agree, right? Like, we're treating integration as a yes-no in a lot of these, and it's obviously very heterogeneous.
Yeah, I wanted to build on that point because, we talk about integration, and, I talk with colleagues about the black box of integration. I mean, when people talk about integration, what do they mean? What are the specific mechanisms that are supposed to deliver positive outcomes? And I think just people really, really need to drill down on that, because a lot of what you were talking about when you talked about formal integration was ownership, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so my familiarity tends to be with managed care, where the insurer is the entity enforcing the integration, and a capitation payment is one of the mechanisms. Now you can, there are a number of mechanisms that can be built into capitation, one of which is, setting provider standards, shared information systems. I mean, there are so many, I can go down a long list, but the point is that what we really need to do is to sort of think about what are the integration mechanisms, and that can be translatable. I think one of the issues around this presentation was that it is so, American, in the sense of, these are a lot of American programs that we're talking about here. But I think if we can drill down on that, it's much more translatable to different healthcare systems.
I agree completely, right? Again, I'm just adding them as we go. They'll be in the record. Thank you.